The snow had been falling steadily since tea time, transforming Hollybridge Lane into something from a Christmas card, the sort of picturesque London street where gaslight gleamed golden through frosted windows and the very air seemed to hum with seasonal goodwill. As I stood before the elegant Georgian townhouse at number 12, stamping my feet against the cold and adjusting my muffler, I could hear the warm murmur of conversation and laughter drifting from within. Lady Pemberton's annual Christmas Eve soiree was, by all accounts, one of the most coveted invitations of the season. I had come at the enthusiastic urging of my old friend Captain Morrison, who had cornered me at my club that very afternoon. "Hastings, old fellow, you simply must join us tonight," he had declared, his weathered face bright with anticipation. "Lady Pemberton has promised to unveil the most extraordinary piece, the Rajah's Eye, a ruby necklace that once belonged to an Indian prince. Worth a king's ransom, they say, and she's donating it to the British Museum after Christmas. Quite the generous gesture, what?" Lady Constance Pemberton was indeed known for her generosity, though perhaps even more for her sharp wit and impeccable taste. A widow of considerable means and even greater social influence, she had transformed her Hollybridge Lane residence into a salon where politicians, artists, and intellectuals gathered to exchange ideas along with gossip. Tonight's gathering was smaller than usual, perhaps a dozen carefully chosen guests, creating an atmosphere of intimate celebration rather than grand spectacle. The drawing room glowed with warmth and elegance. A magnificent Christmas tree dominated one corner, its branches heavy with crystal ornaments and tiny electric lights that cast dancing shadows across the silk-papered walls. Holly and mistletoe adorned the mantelpiece, where a cheerful fire crackled beneath an oil portrait of Lady Pemberton's late husband, the distinguished diplomat Sir Reginald. "Hastings, how delightful that you could join us," Lady Pemberton greeted me, extending a gloved hand. At 62, she remained a striking woman, her silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon, her emerald silk gown perfectly complementing her keen grey eyes. "Morrison has been singing your praises all evening. Apparently you've become quite the amateur detective through your association with that remarkable Belgian gentleman." I felt the familiar flush of embarrassment. "My friend Poirot is the detective, Lady Pemberton. I merely observe." "Modesty ill becomes you," she replied with a knowing smile. "But come, let me introduce you properly to our little circle." The assembled company was, as Morrison had promised, quite distinguished. Dr. Reginald Ashworth, a prominent Harley Street physician with prematurely white hair and nervous hands, stood near the fireplace engaged in animated discussion with Mrs. Vivian Blackwood, a handsome woman in her 40s whose late husband had been a noted collector of Oriental antiquities. Her stepson, young Timothy Blackwood, lounged nearby with the casual elegance of a man who had never known want, though his pale blue eyes held a restless quality that suggested all was not entirely well in his privileged world. Miss Sarah Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's niece and presumed heir, moved gracefully among the guests, her auburn hair catching the firelight as she laughed at something said by Mr. James Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman of the Foreign Office whose diplomatic career had taken him throughout the empire. The Reverend Dr. Phillips, a scholarly clergyman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, completed our intimate gathering, along with Mrs. Cartwright, Lady Pemberton's companion and secretary, a quiet, efficient woman whose sharp intelligence was evident in her observant dark eyes. "Now then," Lady Pemberton announced as the clock struck 9, "before we settle in for our traditional Christmas Eve readings, I have a special treat for you all." She moved to an ornate Chinese cabinet and withdrew a velvet-lined case. The Rajah's Eye, my late husband's final acquisition, and perhaps his most magnificent. The necklace that emerged from the case drew gasps of genuine admiration. The centerpiece was an enormous ruby, easily 30 carats, that seemed to capture and hold every bit of light in the room. Surrounding it were diamonds arranged in an intricate pattern that spoke of royal craftsmanship, while the gold setting bore the delicate filigree work characteristic of Mughal artistry. "My word," breathed Dr. Ashworth, leaning forward for a closer look. "It's absolutely extraordinary." "Indeed it is," Lady Pemberton replied, her voice carrying a note of pride. "According to the documentation Reginald uncovered, it belonged to a Maharaja in colonial Bengal before finding its way to European collectors. The insurance valuation is quite staggering, nearly £300,000. Young Timothy Blackwood let out a low whistle. "I say, Aunt Constance, surely you don't keep such a thing lying about the house." "Only for tonight," she assured him. "Tomorrow it goes to the bank vault, and after the new year to the British Museum as Reginald always intended. But I wanted our Christmas circle to see it first, his final gift to the friends who meant so much to him." As she spoke, I noticed the various reactions around the room. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes remained fixed on the necklace with an intensity that seemed almost hungry. Dr. Ashworth's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his brandy. Miss Sarah's expression was unreadable, though her fingers toyed nervously with her own modest pearl necklace. Mr. Whitmore studied the piece with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating valuable objects, while Mrs. Cartwright made careful notes in a small leather book. "The documentation is fascinating," Lady Pemberton continued, clearly enjoying her role as hostess. "The ruby is said to carry a curse. Death to any who steal it from its rightful owner. Superstitious nonsense, of course, but rather romantic, don't you think?" The Reverend Dr. Phillips smiled gently. "I've always found that the most beautiful treasures often carry the most terrible stories. Perhaps that's what makes them so compelling." Lady Pemberton carefully returned the necklace to its case and locked it with a small golden key, which she then placed in her evening bag. "There now. Safe until morning. Shall we move to the library for our readings? I've selected some particularly appropriate passages from Dickens." It was as we were filing into the adjoining library that the lights flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness there was a moment of startled silence, followed by nervous laughter and the rustle of evening clothes as people moved uncertainly. "Please, everyone remain calm," Lady Pemberton's voice called out. "Mrs. Cartwright, if you would check the fuses in the basement. I'm sure it's merely the storm affecting the electrical supply." But before Mrs. Cartwright could respond, a different sound cut through the darkness, a sharp gasp, followed by the crash of something heavy falling. When the lights flickered back on perhaps 30 seconds later, we found Lady Pemberton collapsed beside the Chinese cabinet, her face contorted in agony, her evening bag clutched in her hands. Dr. Ashworth was beside her in an instant, his medical training overriding the shock that had frozen the rest of us. His examination was swift but thorough, and when he looked up, his face was grave. "I'm afraid she's gone," he said quietly. "Some form of rapid-acting poison, I should think, though I cannot be certain without a proper examination. It was young Timothy who voiced what we were all thinking. The necklace, is it still there?" With trembling hands, Mrs. Cartwright opened the cabinet. The velvet case remained exactly where Lady Pemberton had placed it, the lock undisturbed. Whatever had killed our hostess, it had not been a robbery gone wrong. As the full horror of the situation settled upon us, I found myself thinking of my friend Poirot and his often repeated observation that the most interesting crimes are those that make no immediate sense. Here we had a locked room, a valuable treasure left untouched, and a woman who had seemed in perfect health, struck down in an instant. The snow continued to fall outside, effectively cutting us off from the outside world, while somewhere among our small gathering lurked a murderer whose motive remained as mysterious as their method. I excused myself and made my way to Lady Pemberton's study, where I placed a telephone call to a modest flat in Whitehaven Mansions. "My dear Poirot," I said when that familiar, precise voice answered, "I fear we have need of your little grey cells. There has been a most perplexing murder, and I believe only you can make sense of it." The game, as they say, was afoot. I returned to the drawing room to find our small gathering arranged in what could only be described as a tableau of mutual suspicion. The warmth and conviviality of the evening had evaporated as completely as morning mist, replaced by an atmosphere thick with unspoken accusations and barely concealed fear. The Christmas tree, which had seemed so festive mere hours earlier, now cast dancing shadows that appeared almost sinister in the flickering firelight. Dr. Ashworth had assumed the role of medical authority with admirable efficiency, though I observed that his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the tablecloth covering Lady Pemberton's still form. His professional composure seemed to be fraying at the edges, and I noticed him glancing repeatedly toward the Chinese cabinet, as if expecting it to yield some clue to the mystery. "The rapidity of the poison's action," he murmured to himself, "suggests something quite sophisticated, not the sort of thing one stumbles upon by accident." Mrs. Vivian Blackwood maintained her elegant bearing with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to society's scrutiny, yet her dark eyes continued to dart about the room with calculating intensity. She had positioned herself strategically near the fireplace, from where she could observe all the other guests while appearing to comfort her stepson. Timothy, meanwhile, had fortified himself with brandy and grown increasingly agitated, pacing the Persian carpet like a caged animal. The easy charm he had displayed earlier had vanished, replaced by a nervous energy that made him seem almost furtive. "This is absolutely ghastly," he muttered for perhaps the dozenth time. "Poor Aunt Constance, and on Christmas Eve of all nights. Who could have done such a thing? The necklace is still there, untouched. What possible motive could there be?" His stepmother's response was swift and sharp. "Timothy, please try to contain yourself. Your agitation is helping no one, least of all poor Constance." Miss Sarah Pemberton had withdrawn to a corner chair, her auburn hair catching the firelight as she sat in apparent contemplation. As Lady Pemberton's niece and presumed heir, she occupied the most precarious position among our group, though her grief appeared genuine. Yet beneath her composed exterior, I detected a keen intelligence at work. Her eyes moved constantly, cataloguing every gesture and expression of her fellow guests with the thoroughness of a natural observer. The Reverend Dr. Phillips had offered a quiet prayer for Lady Pemberton's soul, and now sat reading from a small leather-bound Bible, his gentle presence providing a strange counterpoint to the unfolding horror. His scholarly demeanor remained intact, though I noticed his gaze occasionally lifting from the sacred text to study his companions with what could only be described as academic interest. Mr. Whitmore of the Foreign Office embodied diplomatic discretion personified. He stood by the frost-covered window, ostensibly watching the relentless snowfall, though I suspected his attention was focused primarily on the room's occupants. His questions to the other guests were subtle but persistent, delivered with the practiced skill of a man accustomed to extracting information without appearing to interrogate. Mrs. Cartwright moved through the room with quiet efficiency, ensuring doors were secured and offering tea to those who wanted it. Her grief, if she felt any, was meticulously contained beneath a veneer of practical competence. As Lady Pemberton's companion and secretary, she had been privy to her employer's most intimate affairs, a position that made her both invaluable and potentially dangerous. It was approaching midnight when the distinctive sound of measured footsteps on the front path announced Poirot's arrival. Mrs. Cartwright admitted him, and I felt the familiar surge of relief as that small, impeccably dressed figure appeared in the doorway. Despite his journey through the storm, not a fleck of snow marred his dark overcoat, and his famous moustache remained perfectly waxed. "Mes amis," he said, removing his gloves with characteristic precision, "I regret that we meet under such tragic circumstances, but perhaps you will permit me to examine the scene before we proceed further." His inspection was methodical and thorough. He studied Lady Pemberton's body from every conceivable angle, paying particular attention to her hands and the contents of her evening bag. The Chinese cabinet received equal scrutiny, as did the electrical fixtures and the undisturbed necklace case. Throughout this examination, he maintained a running commentary in his precise English, occasionally lapsing into French when his thoughts required more nuanced expression. "Most interesting," he murmured, straightening from his examination of the carpet. "The lady was not moved after death. This much is certain. But observe the position of the body. She has fallen toward the cabinet, as if reaching for something, yet the cabinet remains locked and undisturbed." He turned to address our assembled group, his green eyes sharp with intelligence. "Now then, I must ask each of you to think very carefully about the moments immediately before and after the lights failed. Every detail, however insignificant it may seem, could prove vital to our understanding of this tragedy." The gathering of suspects was complete, and Hercule Poirot had arrived to begin his methodical unraveling of the truth hidden within our closed circle of Christmas guests. Poirot began by establishing order with the methodical precision that marked all his investigations. He requested that the curtains be drawn fully against the swirling snow, the fire built up to chase away the December chill, and additional lamps brought from other rooms to banish every shadow. Then, with characteristic attention to detail, he arranged chairs in a precise semicircle facing Lady Pemberton's favorite armchair, which he claimed for himself. "We shall proceed with exactitude," he announced, withdrawing his leather notebook and gold fountain pen. "Each of you will recount, with the greatest care, your precise position and observations during those crucial moments of darkness. The smallest detail. You must not dismiss it, for often it is the trifle that illuminates the truth." His green eyes swept the assembled company with the calculating gaze of a master chess player contemplating his next move. The firelight played across his features, lending gravity to his precise accent as he began his systematic questioning. "Dr. Ashworth, as a medical man, your observations carry particular weight. You were positioned near the fireplace when the electrical failure occurred." The physician shifted uncomfortably, his hands betraying a slight tremor as he adjusted his spectacles. "Yes, quite correct. I was discussing the remarkable craftsmanship of Oriental gems with Mrs. Blackwood when everything went dark. Lady Pemberton had just suggested we move to the library for the readings. And during those moments of complete darkness, what did you observe?" "Observe?" Dr. Ashworth's laugh held a brittle edge. "My dear Poirot, one observes precious little in absolute darkness. There were sounds, people moving about, someone bumping furniture. I heard Lady Pemberton call out about checking the electrical supply, then that terrible gasp and the crash of her falling." Poirot made a careful notation. "The symptoms you observed upon examination, they suggested what manner of toxin?" "The rapidity suggests something exceptionally potent. Possibly an alkaloid such as strychnine or cyanide. The convulsed features, the sudden collapse, but without proper analysis, I cannot be definitive." He paused, his medical training warring with obvious distress. "There was also a faint scent in the air, something medicinal or chemical, though it could have been from the fireplace." "Très intéressant. Mrs. Blackwood, you were conversing with the good doctor about gemstones. Your impressions of those dark moments?" Mrs. Blackwood maintained her elegant composure with practiced ease. "I remained precisely where I stood when the lights failed. Experience has taught me that movement in darkness often leads to injury. I heard the usual sounds of people in confusion, but I did notice that peculiar scent Dr. Ashworth mentioned. Definitely chemical in nature." "And your expertise in Oriental antiquities?" The Rajah's eye impressed you considerably. A faint flush colored her cheeks. "It is a magnificent specimen. My late husband often spoke of such pieces and their fascinating histories. The craftsmanship was truly exceptional. Such beauty deserves to be appreciated, not locked away in a museum vault." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly at the vehemence in her tone, but he merely nodded and turned to Timothy Blackwood, who had grown increasingly agitated during the questioning. "Monsieur Timothy, you were positioned where during the crucial moments?" "Between the armchair and the sideboard, near the Christmas tree. When everything went dark, I put my hand out to steady myself against the chair back. I didn't move from that spot until the lights returned and I saw poor Aunt Constance on the floor. His voice cracked slightly. "This is absolutely ghastly. Who would want to harm her? And why? The necklace wasn't even touched." "You are certain you remained stationary throughout the darkness?" "Absolutely certain. I heard the crash, then Dr. Ashworth calling for assistance. That's when I went to the sideboard for brandy. I thought it might help." Poirot made another note before addressing Miss Sarah Pemberton, who had been following the questioning with keen attention despite her obvious grief. "Mademoiselle, you were moving toward the library when the lights failed." "Yes, I was actually closest to the doorway. Aunt Constance was just ahead of me, speaking to Mr. Whitmore about the evening's readings." Her voice remained steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "When darkness fell, I heard movement. Someone definitely approached the Chinese cabinet. There's a particular floorboard there that creaks terribly. Uncle Reginald always meant to have it repaired." This detail caused Poirot's attention to sharpen considerably. "You're certain someone approached the cabinet during the darkness?" "Quite certain. That floorboard is distinctive. It's directly in front of the cabinet and makes an unmistakable sound." Mrs. Cartwright confirmed this with a nod. "I can attest to that floorboard. It's been a household nuisance for months." Poirot turned to the diplomat. "Monsieur Whitmore, your position during these events?" "I was by the window, examining Sir Reginald's portrait above the mantelpiece. When darkness fell, I remained stationary. Diplomatic training teaches one to avoid unnecessary movement in uncertain situations." His response was measured and precise. "I heard the fall distinctly, but I also noticed a small metallic sound, like a clasp or latch, that preceded Lady Pemberton's gasp by perhaps a second or two." "The metallic sound preceded the gasp? You are certain of this sequence?" "Absolutely certain." The Reverend Dr. Phillips looked up from the small Bible he still clutched. "I was in the armchair by the bookcase. When the lights failed, I remained in prayer. I heard the fall and perhaps also a rustling sound, like paper being drawn or folded. But there was something else." He paused, his scholarly mind working carefully. "Just before we moved to the library, I observed Lady Pemberton take something from the crystal dish by the mantelpiece clock. She had a habit of taking barley sugar in the evenings. Said it helped her digestion." This observation caused a stir among the assembled company. Poirot's eyes fixed on the small crystal dish, its lid slightly askew. The barley sugar, this was her regular custom? "Every evening in winter," Sarah confirmed quickly. "She was quite particular about it." Mrs. Cartwright spoke for the first time since the questioning began, her voice carefully controlled. Lady Pemberton was indeed methodical in her habits. The barley sugar, her evening constitutional, her correspondence. She paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. "There is something else, Monsieur Poirot. Lady Pemberton recently made alterations to her will. She mentioned it just last week, though she didn't elaborate on the specific changes." The revelation hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Poirot closed his notebook with a decisive snap and rose from his chair, beginning to pace with the measured steps of a man whose mind was rapidly processing multiple possibilities. "So we have established positions, movements, and sounds. But observe what troubles the little gray cells considerably. The Rajah's eye remains untouched in its locked case, yet someone clearly approached the cabinet during those dark moments. This suggests either a failed robbery or something far more sophisticated." He paused before the Chinese cabinet, studying it with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. The darkness lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Sufficient time for one decisive action, but insufficient for complex manipulation. Yet the metallic sound preceded the victim's distress, and the approach to the cabinet was deliberate enough to trigger that distinctive floorboard. His gaze swept the assembled suspects, each face a study in carefully controlled emotion. "Non, mes amis, this was not a crime of opportunity committed in darkness. The darkness was merely the screen behind which a carefully prepared plan was executed. The instrument of death was ready, the victim's habits were known, and the timing was precise. The implications of his words settled over the room like a shroud, and I could see in each face the dawning realization that they were trapped not merely by the storm outside, but by the inexorable logic of Hercule Poirot's investigation. The December morning brought no respite from the storm that had transformed Hollybridge Lane into an Arctic wasteland. Through frost-etched windows, I watched Poirot conduct his methodical examination of the drawing-room with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker. Every surface, every object received his focused attention, but it was the crystal dish containing Lady Pemberton's barley sugar that commanded his most intense scrutiny. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, lifting the crystal lid with his handkerchief. "The good Reverend mentioned Lady Pemberton's evening habit. 1 piece of barley sugar to aid digestion. Yet see how the remaining sweets are arranged." He indicated the contents with his fountain pen. 7 pieces remain, but notice the pattern. 6 are positioned naturally as they would fall, when poured from a container. But this one, he pointed to a single lozenge near the dish's edge. This one has been placed deliberately, separated from the others. Using his penknife, he carefully lifted the isolated sweet. Beneath it, a faint residue marked the crystal. Not the expected stickiness of sugar, but something that caught the light differently, like a thin film of oil. "Most illuminating," he declared, replacing the lid with characteristic precision. "Mrs. Cartwright, if you would join us. I have questions regarding your mistress's evening routine." The companion entered with her usual composed efficiency, though I detected a tremor in her hands as she smoothed her dark dress. Poirot's manner remained courteous but penetrating. "The barley sugar dish. You mentioned refilling it yesterday morning. Was this your regular responsibility?" "Yes, Monsieur Poirot, every Tuesday and Friday without fail. Lady Pemberton was most particular about her routines." "And between yesterday morning and the tragic events of last evening, who might have had occasion to approach the mantelpiece?" Mrs. Cartwright considered carefully. "All the guests, naturally. It's the warmest spot in the room, but I specifically recall Dr. Ashworth examining the clock. He mentioned it kept excellent time, and Mr. Whitmore spent considerable time studying Sir Reginald's portrait above the mantel." Poirot made a note, then requested a private word with Dr. Ashworth. The physician appeared composed, but his medical training couldn't entirely mask the tension in his bearing. "Doctor, your expertise is invaluable in this matter. The symptoms you observed, the rapidity of Lady Pemberton's collapse, suggests what specific category of toxin?" "Something acting on the cardiac system, most likely. The convulsed features, the sudden onset, possibly digitalis in concentrated form, or perhaps cyanide. Both would produce similar presentations." He paused, his professional demeanor wavering slightly. "I should mention, I had prescribed a mild sedative containing digitalis for Lady Pemberton's recent headaches. Perfectly safe in therapeutic doses, but if concentrated, you kept supplies of such medications?" "In my medical bag, naturally. Standard preparations for emergency treatment." Dr. Ashworth's voice carried a defensive edge. "I resent any implication of impropriety." "No impropriety is suggested, merely thoroughness," Poirot replied smoothly. "Now, during your examination of the mantelpiece clock, did you observe anything unusual about the barley sugar dish?" The doctor hesitated. I may have glanced at it. Lady Pemberton had mentioned her evening suite during our earlier conversation about her digestive difficulties." Next, Poirot summoned Timothy Blackwood, whose nervous energy had intensified overnight. The young man's hands shook as he accepted a cup of tea, and his eyes darted constantly toward the Chinese cabinet. "Monsieur Timothy, yesterday evening you mentioned standing near the Christmas tree when the lights failed, yet later you spoke of the sideboard. Perhaps you could clarify your precise position." Timothy's face flushed. Well, you see, it was rather confusing in the dark. I may have moved slightly, steadying myself against furniture. The exact position seems rather unimportant now, doesn't it? In matters of life and death, monsieur, precision is always important. Poirot's tone remained gentle, but implacable. You are familiar with your step-aunt's evening habits? The barley sugar, perhaps? Oh yes, religiously. Every night after dinner, one piece from that crystal dish. Said it settled her stomach. Timothy's nervousness increased visibly. Surely you don't think someone tampered with her sweets? That would be monstrous. Poirot studied him carefully. Indeed, it would require intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, access to the drawing room, and considerable premeditation. Tell me, during your recent financial difficulties, did Lady Pemberton offer assistance? The question struck home. Timothy's composure cracked entirely. She said I needed to learn responsibility, that constant bailouts would only encourage further recklessness, but I would never harm her, regardless of our disagreements. As the morning progressed, Poirot's investigation revealed a troubling pattern. The barley sugar dish had been accessible to all guests. Lady Pemberton's habits were well known to the household, and several individuals possessed both motive and means. Yet the locked necklace case remained untouched, suggesting either a failed theft or something far more complex. The little grey cells, they begin to perceive a design, Poirot murmured as we reviewed his notes. But observe, Hastings, this was no crime of passion committed in darkness. The preparation was meticulous, the execution precise. Our murderer understood human nature as well as Lady Pemberton's routines. The psychological game had begun in earnest, and somewhere among our snowbound gathering, a killer waited to see if their carefully laid plan would withstand the methodical scrutiny of Hercule Poirot's legendary deductive powers. The afternoon brought the unmistakable sound of official authority as Inspector Japp's heavy boots echoed through the entrance hall, accompanied by two constables whose greatcoats shed melting snow onto Mrs. Cartwright's pristine Persian carpet. The inspector's weathered face bore its familiar expression of determined competence, though I detected an underlying satisfaction that suggested he believed the case already solved. "Well, well, Poirot," he declared, removing his bowler hat with characteristic briskness. "Christmas murders in Mayfair. You do have a talent for finding yourself in the thick of things, though I suspect this one won't tax even my modest abilities overmuch." His keen eyes swept the assembled company with professional assessment. "Hastings filled me in on the telephone. Poison in the sweet dish, valuable necklace untouched, and a house full of suspects with secrets. Sounds like a three-pipe problem that'll solve itself with proper police work." Dr. Ashworth had grown increasingly pale as Japp's men conducted their methodical examination of the drawing room. When the inspector requested to examine his medical bag, the physician's hands trembled noticeably as he produced the worn leather case. Japp's inspection was thorough and revealing. Among the usual medical implements, he discovered an empty glass phial bearing traces of a bitter, almond-like scent. "Hydrocyanic acid," Japp announced with grim satisfaction. "Prussic acid to those who prefer plain English. Deadly stuff in even small quantities. The stopper's cracked, Doctor, but that crack looks fresh as this morning's snow. Care to explain how a full phial of poison came to be empty in your possession?" Ashworth's composure cracked entirely. "The stopper has been damaged for weeks. Evaporation is natural with such volatile compounds. I maintain small quantities for legitimate medical purposes. Nothing more." But Japp's men had been thorough. One constable, searching near the fireplace, produced a second phial wrapped in a gentleman's handkerchief. This one contained a few drops of the deadly liquid, its label clearly visible despite obvious attempts to smudge it. "Dropped in the confusion of darkness, I'd wager," Japp observed with professional satisfaction. "Meant to dispose of the evidence but fumbled in the panic. Classic mistake of the amateur poisoner." The motive emerged through careful questioning. Mrs. Blackwood, with obvious reluctance, revealed that Lady Pemberton had recently decided to withdraw her substantial pledge toward the Ashworth Memorial Wing at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The decision had been communicated just days earlier, representing not merely financial loss, but professional humiliation for the distinguished physician. £25,000, Japp noted, consulting his notebook. Plus the prestige of having a hospital wing bear your name. That's motive enough for most men, Doctor. You had access to the victim's habits, knowledge of toxins, and opportunity during the electrical failure. The arrest proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency despite Ashworth's vehement protests. As the handcuffs clicked into place, a collective sigh seemed to escape from our small gathering, the relief of terror finding a target, of chaos resolved into comprehensible human weakness. Yet Poirot, who had observed these proceedings with characteristic attention to detail, now stepped forward with polite but unmistakable disagreement. "Inspector Japp, while your reasoning follows conventional lines, I fear several crucial inconsistencies remain unaddressed. Such as, Japp's tone carried the weary patience of long experience with Poirot's objections. Consider, mon ami, the timing. Cyanide acts with extreme rapidity, within seconds of ingestion. Yet Lady Pemberton consumed her barley sugar. We began moving toward the library, the lights failed, and only then did she collapse. This sequence suggests either delayed action, which cyanide does not permit, or an entirely different method of administration." Poirot's green eyes fixed on the crystal dish with laser intensity. Furthermore, observe the positioning of the contaminated sweet. It was deliberately separated to ensure selection by the victim. Yet if Dr. Ashworth intended poisoning, why choose such an uncertain moment? She might have taken her sweet earlier, or selected a different piece entirely. The logic was inexorable, and I saw doubt creep into Japp's expression despite his determination to close the case. Poirot continued relentlessly. "No, Inspector. This crime required intimate knowledge not merely of Lady Pemberton's habits, but of her precise method of selection. The planning was too sophisticated, the execution too theatrical. Our true murderer remains hidden among us, having successfully directed suspicion toward an innocent man." As Japp's men led the protesting doctor away, the atmosphere in the drawing room grew heavier rather than lighter. The first false lead had been exposed, but somewhere among our snowbound gathering, a far more cunning killer waited to see if their carefully constructed deception would withstand the methodical scrutiny of Hercule Poirot's legendary deductive powers. The departure of Inspector Japp and his unwilling prisoner left our small gathering suspended in an atmosphere of barely controlled tension. The momentary relief that had followed Dr. Ashworth's arrest evaporated like smoke, replaced by the chilling realization that somewhere among us sat a murderer whose carefully constructed deception had nearly succeeded. Poirot positioned himself before the Chinese cabinet, his small figure radiating an intensity that commanded absolute attention despite his deceptively casual manner. "And now, mes amis, we begin the most delicate phase of our investigation," he announced, his green eyes moving deliberately from face to face. The good doctor served admirably as our murderer's scapegoat, his medical knowledge and recent financial difficulties making him an obvious target for suspicion. But our true adversary possesses a far more sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the art of misdirection. He moved to the sideboard and retrieved a fresh crystal dish, placing it carefully on the central table. From his waistcoat pocket, he produced a small paper bag containing barley sugar lozenges identical to those Lady Pemberton had favored. With fastidious precision, he arranged them in the dish, 6 clustered together naturally, one positioned separately near the rim. "We shall conduct a small experiment in human nature," he declared with deceptive lightness. "Each of you will tell me, without touching, which sweet Lady Pemberton would have selected last evening. Then you will demonstrate precisely how she would have taken it." The request seemed innocuous enough, yet I observed how it created an immediate undercurrent of unease among our assembled company. Mrs. Blackwood spoke first, her elegant composure showing hairline cracks of strain. Constance always chose what appeared most appealing, that isolated piece surely, the one closest to her position. Timothy nodded with suspicious eagerness. Yes, absolutely. She would have taken the obvious choice. But Miss Sarah shook her head firmly. No, you're both mistaken. Aunt Constance despised sticky fingers. She invariably used the silver tongs kept beside the dish. Her observation proved accurate when Poirot produced the delicate implements from behind the mantelpiece clock with the flourish of a stage magician. Mrs. Cartwright's contribution carried the authority of intimate knowledge. Lady Pemberton was utterly methodical in her habits. She always selected the leftmost suite, closest to the clock, and replaced the lid immediately afterward. Précisément. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. A habit so consistent it could be exploited by anyone with sufficient observation and planning. He turned his attention to Lady Pemberton's evening bag, which Inspector Japp had left on the console table after his men's examination. Now we shall explore another geography of habit. A lady's reticule reveals as much about her nature as her fingerprints. Mrs. Cartwright, as her companion, you observed Lady Pemberton's method of accessing this bag most frequently. Please demonstrate. The companion complied, though I noticed a fractional hesitation, no more than a caught breath, before her fingers touched the clasp. She pressed it inward with her right thumb while shielding the opening with her left palm, raising the lid barely a hand's breadth. Exactly as I remember, Sarah confirmed. Aunt was always quick and precise in her movements. Poirot's next request seemed equally innocent. Mademoiselle Sarah, show me how she would retrieve the golden key to the Chinese cabinet. Sarah's slender fingers moved unhesitatingly to the bag's inner pocket, demonstrating the automatic nature of long-observed routine. Yet when Poirot clicked the clasp shut with sudden decisiveness, both Mrs. Blackwood and Timothy visibly flinched. Now I make certain announcements, Poirot continued with studied casualness. First, I have contacted Lady Pemberton's solicitors regarding her recently amended will. A sealed copy will arrive this evening under police escort, weather permitting. Timothy's brandy glass rattled audibly against his cuff button. This evening, but surely the roads are impassable. If circumstances allow, Poirot replied smoothly. Second, I have sealed the Chinese cabinet with my personal wax. Any tampering will be immediately evident. Mrs. Blackwood's response came too quickly. Surely, no one would be so foolish as to attempt such a thing now. Indeed, let us hope wisdom prevails. Poirot's tone remained conversational, though his eyes missed nothing. Third, certain traces within the evening bag intrigue me considerably. The faintest residue of a distinctly medicinal scent, not roses or lavender, but something altogether more clinical. The Reverend Dr. Phillips looked up sharply from his Bible. You believe the poison was administered through the bag rather than the barley sugar. I believe, mon révérend, that darkness was employed to create a compelling narrative about contaminated sweets. But consider the sequence of sounds our witnesses reported. The metallic click before the cry of distress, the rustle of paper, the telltale creak of that distinctive floorboard. These suggest something far more sophisticated than simple poisoning. Miss Sarah had grown increasingly pale during this recitation. Are you suggesting the bag itself was somehow weaponized? Not the bag, mademoiselle, but perhaps something within it, or something applied to its clasp, a substance that would act upon contact with the skin. Poirot's gaze swept the assembled company with laser intensity. Such a method would require intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, access to specialized compounds, and nerves of steel to execute in darkness surrounded by witnesses. Mrs. Blackwood had risen from her chair, her elegant bearing betraying subtle signs of strain. This speculation grows increasingly fantastic, Monsieur Poirot. You're describing an impossibly complex crime, when surely the simplest explanation— Ah, but madame, Poirot interrupted gently. In my experience, the most interesting murders are precisely those that appear impossible until one understands the psychology driving them. Tell me, your late husband's collection of Oriental antiquities, did it require specialized preservation treatments? The question struck home with unexpected force. Mrs. Blackwood's composure wavered visibly. Various compounds were necessary, naturally, but I failed to see the relevance to poor Constance's death. The relevance, madame, lies in your familiarity with substances that could produce rapid unconsciousness through dermal contact. Chloroform, perhaps, or certain alkaloids used in artifact preservation. Before Mrs. Blackwood could respond, Sarah spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else, Monsieur Poirot. Something I should have mentioned earlier. Aunt Constance received an anonymous letter last week, a warning against donating the Rajah's eye. It spoke of ancient curses and retribution for ill-gotten gains." This revelation electrified the room. Timothy leaned forward eagerly. "Anonymous threats? But surely that changes everything." "Perhaps," Poirot mused, though Lady Pemberton apparently dismissed it as superstitious nonsense and burned the letter. Yet such communications often reveal more about their authors than their intended recipients. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may add to Miss Sarah's revelation, Lady Pemberton confided her concerns about the necklace's provenance. While legally acquired, the circumstances of her late husband's purchase might be viewed as ethically questionable by modern standards. She feared a public scandal once the details became widely known." The psychological pressure was mounting visibly. Timothy's hands trembled as he reached for his brandy. Mrs. Blackwood's elegant mask was slipping to reveal something harder beneath, and even the composed Mrs. Cartwright showed signs of strain. "So we have motives multiplying like Christmas gifts," Poirot observed with deceptive lightness. "Financial desperation, professional humiliation, inheritance disputes, and the threat of scandal. Yet somewhere among these obvious motives lies the true driving force, the psychology that transformed thought into deadly action." He began rearranging the chairs with characteristic precision, a seemingly pointless ritual that nonetheless restored a sense of order to the increasingly chaotic atmosphere. As he passed me, he spoke in an undertone. "The net tightens, mon ami. Tonight, when the sealed will arrives, we shall see which of our suspects cannot bear the final pressure." The psychological game had begun in earnest, and somewhere among our snowbound gathering, a killer waited to discover whether their carefully constructed deception could withstand the methodical scrutiny of Hercule Poirot's legendary deductive powers. The late afternoon brought an unexpected visitor through the swirling snow, a young clerk from Fairchild and Row. Solicitors, accompanied by a uniformed constable whose presence lent gravity to his mission. Mr. Pritchard, spectacles fogged and clutching a leather satchel as though it contained the crown jewels themselves, delivered Lady Pemberton's sealed will with ceremonious precision. "Delivered under police escort as requested, Monsieur Poirot," he announced, producing the pristine vellum document. "The seal remains intact, and I am authorized to oversee its reading in the presence of all interested parties." Our small gathering reassembled in the drawing room, the Christmas tree's twinkling lights casting dancing shadows that seemed almost ominous in the charged atmosphere. Poirot received the document with characteristic solemnity, examining the unbroken wax seal before breaking it with his penknife. The rustle of expensive paper seemed unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. The contents proved as explosive as our most dramatic expectations. Lady Pemberton had indeed made sweeping alterations to her testament, redistributions that would shock and disappoint several of our assembled company. Miss Sarah inherited the Hollybridge Lane house and a comfortable annuity, but not the vast fortune everyone had assumed would be hers. The bulk of Lady Pemberton's considerable estate, nearly £400,000, was destined for charitable foundations and educational institutions. Most dramatically, Timothy Blackwood was explicitly disinherited, his previous allowance terminated with a scathing paragraph detailing his persistent irresponsibility and chronic inability to manage financial affairs. Mrs. Blackwood received only a modest remembrance, while Mrs. Cartwright was generously provided for, though hardly enriched. The Rajah's eye, however, carried the most intriguing provision. The necklace was to be donated to the British Museum only after authentication by Professor Llewellyn of Oxford. Should any question arise regarding its provenance or the legitimacy of its acquisition, it was to be returned immediately to appropriate Indian authorities rather than displayed in London. Timothy's face had gone ashen during the reading, his hands trembling so violently that brandy slopped onto the Persian carpet. "Authentication?" he stammered. "But surely there's no question about its genuineness." "Apparently your step-aunt harbored certain concerns," Poirot observed, his green eyes studying each face with laser intensity. "Most illuminating, this clause. It suggests Lady Pemberton feared scandal more than she valued the necklace's cultural significance. What followed transformed our entire understanding of the crime." Poirot approached the Chinese cabinet with renewed purpose, examining his wax seal with a magnifying glass. "Observe, mes amis, the tiniest smear at the edge, as though a warm finger tested its firmness. Not last evening when it was soft, but today when it had fully hardened." With ceremonious precision, he retrieved the cabinet key from Lady Pemberton's evening bag and opened the lock. The velvet case emerged, deep purple in the firelight, and Poirot lifted the lid with his handkerchief-wrapped fingers. The collective gasp that followed was involuntary and profound. Even before he spoke, we understood. The central ruby sat lifeless in its setting, failing to capture and hold the light as it had the previous evening. The surrounding diamonds glittered with mechanical precision, lacking the subtle fire of genuine stones. "Glass and foiled paste," Mrs. Blackwood declared, her elegant composure cracking entirely. "And not even superior workmanship. Observe the uneven collis, the casting marks on the gold mount. Whoever created this copy worked from photographs, not the original piece." The implications struck our gathering like physical blows. Timothy swore under his breath, color flooding his face before draining away completely. Mrs. Cartwright sat heavily, as though the room had shifted beneath her feet. Mr. Whitmore leaned forward with diplomatic dismay, precisely calibrated to the occasion. Miss Sarah's eyes filled not with tears, but with fierce humiliation on her aunt's behalf. "So we confront a revelation that transforms everything," Poirot announced, replacing the lid with reverence despite the forgery. "The theft did not occur last evening during our theatrical darkness. It occurred days, perhaps weeks ago, executed with calm deliberation by someone with intimate access to Lady Pemberton's household." He began his characteristic pacing, his small figure radiating intense concentration. The sounds during the electrical failure, the creaking floorboard, the metallic click, the rustle of paper, these were not the sounds of theft in progress. They were the sounds of someone creating a narrative, a false trail to obscure the true timeline of the crime. The psychological pressure was mounting visibly among our suspects. Mrs. Blackwood's expertise in identifying the forgery had been too immediate, too detailed. Timothy's shock seemed genuine, but his earlier nervousness took on new significance. Mrs. Cartwright's intimate knowledge of household routines made her a prime candidate for orchestrating the original theft. "Consider the psychology, mes amis," Poirot continued relentlessly. "Our murderer possessed not merely access and opportunity, but intimate knowledge of Lady Pemberton's habits, her evening routine, her method of selecting barley sugar. The darkness was theatre, a misdirection to focus our attention on attempted robbery while concealing the fact that the theft had already been accomplished." Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may speak confidentially, Lady Pemberton had recently received inquiries from certain government offices regarding items in Sir Reginald's collection. Nothing formal, but enough to cause her considerable anxiety about potential complications." This revelation struck Timothy like a physical blow. "You mean the necklace might have been confiscated anyway, all this death and horror, and the thing might have been taken from us regardless?" "Not taken, monsieur. Returned to its rightful custodians," Poirot corrected gently. But observe how this knowledge creates desperate motives. Someone who had already stolen the original would face not merely criminal charges, but the ultimate irony of having committed murder for treasure that was destined to be repatriated. Mrs. Cartwright spoke in a carefully controlled voice. Lady Pemberton mentioned receiving another anonymous letter yesterday morning. She burned it immediately, but seemed quite shaken. She muttered something about ungrateful serpents and knowing where the bodies are buried. The phrase hung in the air like incense, heavy with menace. If Lady Pemberton had identified her tormentor, her murder became not inheritance greed or theft gone wrong, but the desperate act of someone whose secrets were about to be exposed. Poirot examined the velvet case one final time, his trained eye catching details that escaped the rest of us. The little grey cells perceive a pattern of extraordinary sophistication. We have not one crime, but a carefully orchestrated campaign that culminated in murder when other methods failed to achieve the desired result. The storm outside had intensified, effectively trapping us with a killer whose desperation was growing more dangerous by the hour. As darkness gathered beyond the frost-covered windows, I could only hope that Poirot's methodical approach would expose the truth before another life was lost to the twisted psychology that had already claimed Lady Pemberton's life and stolen a treasure that was never truly ours to possess. The game had entered its most perilous phase, and somewhere among our snowbound gathering, a murderer waited to discover whether their elaborate deception could withstand the relentless scrutiny of Hercule Poirot's legendary deductive powers. The December evening descended with the weight of accumulated secrets, transforming Lady Pemberton's elegant drawing room into a stage where shadows seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. Poirot had spent the afternoon in methodical preparation, positioning himself like a chess master contemplating the endgame. The constable who had escorted the solicitor remained stationed strategically in the entrance hall, while our small gathering dispersed throughout the house with the restless energy of caged animals sensing approaching danger. It was during his systematic re-examination of the crime scene that Poirot made the discovery that would prove crucial to understanding the true sophistication of our murderer's plan. Using his magnifying glass with the precision of a jeweler, he examined the brass electrical fixtures that had failed so conveniently the previous evening. "Hastings, observe this most illuminating detail," he murmured, indicating barely visible scratches on the switch mechanism near the library door. The fresh metal exposed beneath the patina told a story of recent manipulation with considerable force. More significantly, his penknife extracted a tiny fragment of expensive dark wool caught on the fixture's edge, evidence that someone had deliberately sabotaged the electrical system. Mrs. Cartwright, summoned to explain the household's electrical arrangements, provided the missing piece of the puzzle. The basement door was ajar when I went to check the fuses, she admitted with obvious reluctance. Most unusual, as Lady Pemberton kept it bolted for security. The main circuit breaker had been deliberately tripped, not by the storm, but by human intervention. The implications were staggering. Our murderer had not merely taken advantage of convenient darkness, but had orchestrated it with the precision of a theatrical director, ensuring the crucial moments would unfold exactly as planned. Poirot's examination of Lady Pemberton's escritoire yielded an even more explosive discovery. Hidden beneath the leather blotter lay a sheet of her personal stationery, bearing the family crest, the ink still fresh despite being a day old. The elegant script was unmistakably hers, though the content was fragmentary, the beginning of a letter that had been fatally interrupted. "My dear Inspector Morrison," the partial text read, "I write regarding certain irregularities that have come to my attention concerning the Rajah's eye. After careful examination by Professor Llewellyn, I have discovered that what I believe to be my late husband's final acquisition is in fact an extremely sophisticated forgery. The implications are most disturbing, as this suggests." Using his pencil rubbed lightly across the surface, Poirot revealed the ghostly impression of words pressed through from a second sheet. Betrayal by one I trusted completely makes this discovery doubly painful. The police must be informed immediately, regardless of personal consequences. The revelation struck our gathering like a physical blow. Lady Pemberton had not only discovered the theft, but had identified her betrayer and was preparing to contact the authorities when death intervened. The timing was too precise, too convenient to be anything but murder committed to prevent exposure. It was approaching 9 o'clock when a strangled cry echoed through the house. Not quite a scream, but the sound of breath and will failing simultaneously. We found Mrs. Cartwright collapsed in the library before the hearth, a small glass beside her hand, and the unmistakable scent of bitter almonds and laudanum heavy in the air. On the table beside her lay a sealed envelope addressed in neat handwriting. For Monsieur Poirot. The letter within confessed to stealing the Rajah's eye, admitted to poisoning the barley sugar, and announced a resolve to end a guilty life rather than face public disgrace. It concluded with pious benedictions and a request that the necklace be returned whence it came. But Poirot's examination revealed the deception immediately. Observe, Hastings, the envelope has been resealed with paste rather than original adhesive, and scented with clove rather than the expected gum arabic. Most significantly, the handwriting slopes left, while Mrs. Cartwright's natural hand inclines right by 7 degrees. As we worked to revive the unconscious woman with strong coffee and medical attention, Poirot discovered that the safe in Lady Pemberton's study stood slightly ajar. The red leather ledger containing Sir Reginald's correspondence was missing, along with a packet of letters bound with blue ribbon, documents that might have contained evidence of the necklace's questionable provenance or other compromising information. With Mrs. Cartwright's life hanging in the balance and the false confession exposed, Poirot began his final psychological assault on the true killer. Rather than direct confrontation, he employed the subtle pressure of accumulated evidence and inexorable logic. "We observe a crime of extraordinary sophistication," he announced to our assembled company. "The electrical sabotage required technical knowledge and advanced planning. The theft of the original necklace demanded intimate access and considerable time. The murder itself was timed to prevent Lady Pemberton from contacting the authorities about her discoveries." He paused, his green eyes moving deliberately from face to face. "But most revealing of all is this desperate attempt to silence Mrs. Cartwright and destroy the documentary evidence. Our murderer believes they can erase the past and perfume the present, but both leave traces that the little grey cells can detect." The atmosphere in the drawing room had become electric with tension. Someone among our small circle was a killer whose elaborate deception was unraveling thread by thread. The storm continued to rage outside, trapping us with a murderer whose desperation was growing more dangerous with each passing moment. As Poirot methodically replaced each piece of evidence in its exact position, straightening papers and adjusting angles with obsessive precision, I recognized the signs of a master detective preparing for his final revelation. The psychological game that had begun with Lady Pemberton's death was approaching its climax, and somewhere among our snowbound gathering, a killer waited to discover whether their carefully constructed facade could withstand the relentless scrutiny of Hercule Poirot's legendary deductive powers. The net was tightening, and tomorrow would bring either justice or another tragedy to the elegant townhouse on Hollybridge Lane. The house settled into an unnatural quiet as Christmas Day dawned, the storm finally abating to leave Hollybridge Lane blanketed in pristine snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the weak winter sunlight. Poirot had spent the night in methodical preparation, positioning himself like a chess master contemplating the final moves of an intricate game. Mrs. Cartwright, pale but recovering from her ordeal, occupied a chair near the fireplace under the watchful eye of the constable, while our small gathering assembled with the reluctant resignation of players whose roles in the drama were about to be definitively revealed. During the dark hours, Poirot's patient surveillance had yielded crucial evidence. His examination of the study revealed clear signs of unauthorized entry. The safe's combination dial showed fresh fingerprint impressions in talcum powder, while scattered newspaper cuttings near the hearth bore the telltale creases of someone moving stealthily in darkness. Most significantly, he had recovered a small glass phial bearing traces of the same bitter, almond-like scent that had lingered in Lady Pemberton's evening bag. "The little grey cells have been most active during these quiet hours," he announced to our assembled company, his green eyes moving deliberately from face to face. "The attempted poisoning of Mrs. Cartwright and the theft of Sir Reginald's correspondence were desperate acts by someone whose carefully constructed deception was unraveling thread by thread." He moved to the Chinese cabinet with characteristic precision, using it as his lectern for the methodical revelation that was about to unfold. The morning light streaming through frost-etched windows transformed the drawing room into a theater of justice, every detail calculated to focus attention on the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of sophisticated misdirection. We begin with the theft of the Raja's eye, which occurred not during our theatrical darkness 2 evenings past, but weeks earlier, executed by someone with intimate knowledge of household routines and unlimited access to Lady Pemberton's private quarters. Poirot's accented voice carried absolute authority as he produced the partial letter from Lady Pemberton's escritoire. "This incomplete correspondence reveals that our victim had discovered the forgery and was preparing to contact the authorities when death intervened." Timothy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his brandy glass trembling in his white-knuckled grip. "But surely the electrical failure, the sounds near the cabinet—" "Elaborate theatre, Monsieur Timothy. The sabotaged electrical system was designed to create a false narrative of robbery interrupted by accidental death, while concealing the fact that the theft had already been accomplished." Poirot's tone remained conversational despite the devastating nature of his revelations. The metallic click our witnesses heard was not the sound of the cabinet lock, but Lady Pemberton's evening bag clasp opening under the pressure of her death grip. He moved to the mantelpiece and retrieved the crystal dish containing the barley sugar, handling it with his handkerchief-wrapped fingers. The contaminated sweet was indeed a crucial element, but not in the manner we initially suspected. The poison was applied not to the candy itself, but to the silver tongs Lady Pemberton invariably used to avoid sticky fingers, a contact toxin that would act through dermal absorption, requiring intimate knowledge of the victim's methodical habits. Mrs. Blackwood maintained her elegant composure through sheer force of will, though her dark eyes betrayed the strain of prolonged deception. "This analysis assumes considerable premeditation, Monsieur Poirot. Such elaborate planning seems inconsistent with crimes of passion." "Ah, but madame, passion and premeditation are not mutually exclusive. Consider the psychology driving our murderer, someone who felt entitled to the necklace, who viewed its eventual donation to the museum as a betrayal of legitimate claims." Poirot's pacing emphasized each crucial point with mathematical precision. The anonymous letters threatening Lady Pemberton, the technical knowledge required for electrical sabotage, the sophisticated understanding of contact poisons used in artifact preservation. These suggest someone with both personal investment and professional expertise. Miss Sarah gasped audibly as the implications became clear. "You mean someone connected to the antiquities trade? Someone who understood both the necklace's true value and the methods needed to steal it undetected?" "Précisément, mademoiselle. But observe the final irony. Our murderer's elaborate crime accomplished nothing. The necklace's questionable provenance would have resulted in its repatriation, regardless of Lady Pemberton's intentions. Murder was committed to prevent a donation that legal challenges would have rendered impossible." As Poirot arranged his evidence with characteristic attention to detail, the psychological pressure mounted visibly among our suspects. The morning light revealed faces etched with exhaustion and fear, while somewhere among our snowbound gathering, a killer waited to discover whether their carefully constructed facade could withstand the methodical scrutiny of Hercule Poirot's legendary deductive powers. "The final gathering approaches. Mes amis," he announced with quiet satisfaction. Tonight, when darkness falls once more upon Hollybridge Lane, we shall expose the truth that has been hidden beneath layers of deception, misdirection, and murder. The little grey cells have perceived the pattern at last, and justice will not be long delayed. The net was tightening inexorably, and our Christmas mystery was approaching its climactic resolution. The winter evening descended with ceremonial gravity as Poirot summoned our small gathering to Lady Pemberton's drawing-room for the final time. The Christmas tree's lights cast dancing shadows across faces etched with exhaustion and barely concealed fear, while the constable positioned himself strategically near the door. Mrs. Cartwright, pale but determined to witness justice, occupied her chair with quiet dignity as Poirot arranged his evidence with characteristic precision. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his accented voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we have reached the moment when all deceptions must fall away like autumn leaves, revealing the bare branches of truth beneath. The crime we have witnessed was not a simple murder born of greed or passion, but an elaborate symphony of deception orchestrated by a mind of considerable sophistication and intimate knowledge." He moved to the Chinese cabinet, using it as his lectern for the methodical revelation that would transform our understanding completely. The firelight played across his features as he withdrew his leather notebook, each page representing hours of meticulous observation and deduction. "We begin with the fundamental deception. The theft of the Rajah's eye occurred not during our theatrical darkness 2 evenings past, but weeks earlier, executed by someone with unlimited access to this household and profound expertise in Oriental antiquities." Poirot produced Lady Pemberton's incomplete letter, its elegant script catching the lamplight. Our victim had discovered the substitution and was preparing to contact Inspector Morrison when death intervened with suspicious convenience. Timothy's brandy glass trembled audibly against his cuff button. But surely the electrical failure, the sounds we all heard near the cabinet— "Elaborate misdirection, Monsieur Timothy. The sabotaged electrical system was designed to create a false narrative of robbery interrupted by accidental death, while concealing the fact that the original theft had been accomplished weeks earlier." Poirot's green eyes moved deliberately from face to face. The metallic click our witnesses reported was not the cabinet lock being forced, but Lady Pemberton's evening bag clasp responding to the pressure of her death grip. With characteristic precision, Poirot retrieved the silver tongs from beside the crystal dish, handling them with his handkerchief-wrapped fingers. The poison was applied not to the barley sugar itself. That would have been crude and uncertain, but to these tongs that Lady Pemberton invariably used to avoid sticky fingers. A contact neurotoxin absorbed through the skin, requiring intimate knowledge of her methodical habits and access to specialized preservation compounds. He produced the small glass phial recovered from the study, its surface bearing telltale residue. This container held the concentrated toxin, a compound familiar to anyone who has worked extensively with the preservation of ancient artifacts. The same chemicals used to protect precious objects from decay can, in concentrated form, become instruments of death. Mrs. Blackwood's elegant composure showed hairline cracks of strain as Poirot continued his relentless exposition. The electrical sabotage required technical knowledge and advanced planning. The basement door left ajar, the deliberately tripped circuit breaker, the scratches on the switch mechanism, all evidence of someone who understood both the household's routines and the dramatic timing necessary for their deception. "But observe the true sophistication of our crime," Poirot declared, approaching the Chinese cabinet once more. "The creation of this magnificent forgery required not merely artistic skill, but profound understanding of Mughal craftsmanship, access to appropriate materials, and the technical expertise to age the piece convincingly. Such knowledge is not acquired casually. It represents years of specialized study and practical experience." His gaze fixed on Mrs. Blackwood with laser intensity. "Your immediate identification of the forgery yesterday was too detailed, too precise for casual observation. You spoke of uneven collets and casting marks. technical terminology that revealed intimate familiarity with both authentic pieces and their replications. "Consider the psychology driving our murderer," Poirot continued, his pacing emphasizing each crucial revelation. "Someone who felt not merely entitled to the necklace, but morally justified in preventing what they viewed as cultural vandalism. The anonymous letters threatening Lady Pemberton were not external warnings, but internal pressure, designed to dissuade her from the museum donation." Miss Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "You mean someone who believed they were protecting the necklace rather than stealing it?" "Précisément, mademoiselle. Someone whose late husband's collection included pieces acquired through the same questionable channels as Sir Reginald's treasures. Someone who viewed the Rajah's eye as rightfully belonging with complementary artifacts that told a complete story of artistic achievement." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Mrs. Blackwood rose from her chair with regal composure, though her hands betrayed the slightest tremor. "These are serious accusations, Monsieur Poirot. I trust you have evidence beyond speculation and circumstance." "The evidence, madame, lies in your own expertise and actions. Your knowledge of preservation compounds, provided the means. Your frequent visits to this household gave you opportunity to study Lady Pemberton's habits in minute detail. Your access to your late husband's workshop provided the tools and materials necessary for creating the forgery." Poirot's tone carried infinite sadness for human weakness transformed into deadly purpose. He produced the recovered correspondence from Sir Reginald's collection. These stolen letters reveal the true history of both collections, pieces acquired under circumstances that would not withstand modern scrutiny. Lady Pemberton's decision to donate the necklace to the British Museum would have triggered authentication processes that might have exposed not only the Rajah's eye's questionable provenance, but similar issues with your husband's collection. Mrs. Blackwood's elegant mask finally cracked entirely, revealing the desperate woman beneath. "You understand nothing of justice or proper custodianship. That necklace belonged with Reginald's collection, pieces that complemented each other, that told the complete story of Mughal artistry across centuries. Constance would have buried it in some sterile museum display, stripped of context and meaning, subject to bureaucratic scrutiny that would have destroyed everything my husband worked to preserve." Her voice rose with passionate conviction. "I felt justified in preventing cultural vandalism, in protecting treasures that deserved better than political correctness and modern guilt about imperial history. The Rajah's eye was meant to inspire wonder, not serve as evidence for historical grievances." "So you felt justified in theft and murder to preserve your vision of proper stewardship?" Poirot's question carried no judgment, only infinite weariness at humanity's capacity for self-deception. "I felt justified in preventing the destruction of beauty and historical continuity," she replied with fierce pride, even as the constable moved forward with handcuffs. Constance's high-minded scruples would have scattered the collection to the winds, subjected every piece to hostile examination by people who understood nothing of their true significance. As Mrs. Blackwood's confession hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of misguided passion and deadly consequence, Poirot carefully returned each piece of evidence to its precise position. The psychological game that had begun with Lady Pemberton's death had reached its inevitable conclusion, revealing the terrible price of believing that personal conviction justified any action, no matter how extreme. "The little grey cells observe a tragedy of the highest order," Poirot murmured as the constable led Mrs. Blackwood away. "A crime committed not from base greed, but from misguided love of beauty and fear of cultural loss. Yet murder remains murder, regardless of the nobility of the murderer's self-perception." Timothy covered his face with trembling hands, while Miss Sarah stood at the frost-covered window, gazing out at a world made clean by snow in pale starlight. The Reverend Dr. Phillips closed his Bible over a whispered prayer for both victim and perpetrator. "Order," Poirot observed, adjusting the mantelpiece clock by a precise minute, "is the solace of the living. But true justice recognizes that the greatest treasures, human life, trust, the bonds of friendship, cannot be preserved through deception and violence. As we prepared to leave Hollybridge Lane, the Christmas bells began their ancient peal across London's snow-covered rooftops. Justice had finally come to the elegant townhouse, though the victory felt hollow in the shadow of lives destroyed by the very treasures meant to inspire wonder and appreciation for human artistry across the centuries. The affair at Hollybridge Lane was closed, but its lessons about the dangerous intersection of passion, expertise, and moral certainty would linger long after the last echoes of our footsteps faded into the winter night. The arrest of Mrs. Blackwood brought an unexpected stillness to the elegant drawing-room, as though the very walls exhaled in relief at the exposure of long-hidden truths. The Christmas tree's lights continued their gentle dance, but the shadows they cast seemed cleaner somehow, purged of the menace that had lurked in corners and behind carefully composed faces. Poirot moved through the space with characteristic precision, ensuring every detail was properly documented before the machinery of justice completed its inexorable work. Inspector Japp's return at dawn with search warrants yielded the final pieces of our elaborate puzzle. Hidden within Mrs. Blackwood's Belgravia residence, investigators discovered a sophisticated workshop equipped with all the tools and materials necessary for creating museum-quality forgeries. The authentic Raja's eye sat in a place of honor among other questionable treasures, its ruby centerpiece capturing the winter light with the fire that had been so conspicuously absent from its glass substitute. More damning still were the detailed sketches and measurements that revealed months of meticulous preparation. Mrs. Blackwood had studied the necklace during her social visits with the thoroughness of a master craftsman, noting every facet of its construction and the precise arrangement of its diamonds. Her expertise in artifact preservation had provided both the technical knowledge and the chemical compounds necessary for her elaborate deception. Professor Llewellyn, summoned from Oxford with appropriate urgency, arrived with skepticism and departed with astonishment. His authentication was unequivocal. The recovered piece was genuine Mughal craftsmanship of the highest order. A junior official from the India office appeared with memoranda that had been quietly awaiting resolution in governmental files, and arrangements were swiftly made for the necklace's eventual repatriation to appropriate Indian cultural institutions. Timothy Blackwood had aged visibly in the span of days, his boyish features etched with the premature lines of someone forced to confront mortality and deception within his own family circle. Yet when Mr. Whitmore discreetly arranged a position with a Liverpool shipping firm, opportunities for advancement contingent upon sobriety and industry, Timothy accepted with a dignity that surprised us all. Perhaps the shock of near poverty had awakened something worthwhile in his character. Miss Sarah, now mistress of the Hollybridge Lane house, processed her grief with the quiet strength that would have pleased her aunt. She asked Mrs. Cartwright to remain, not as a servant, but as a companion, and spoke without ostentation of establishing a scholarship in Lady Pemberton's name. The gesture carried both memorial and promise, beauty preserved through generosity rather than possession. Dr. Ashworth, released with profuse apologies, struggled to process his role as an unwitting scapegoat. His medical bag had been deliberately contaminated to provide false evidence, his financial difficulties exploited to make him an ideal suspect. Yet when he examined Mrs. Cartwright's recovery with professional thoroughness and gentle concern, I witnessed the restoration of a man's fundamental decency despite his ordeal. The case resonated far beyond Mayfair's elegant drawing rooms, raising uncomfortable questions about the ethics of private collecting and the complex legacy of imperial acquisition. Mrs. Blackwood's genuine expertise and passionate advocacy for cultural preservation had enabled her to rationalize theft and murder as acts of protection against bureaucratic destruction and political correctness. The most dangerous criminals, mon ami, Poirot observed as we prepared to leave Hollybridge Lane for the final time, are not those driven by simple greed or passion, but those who commit evil in service of what they perceive as higher principles. Mrs. Blackwood genuinely believed she was protecting irreplaceable treasures from cultural vandalism, yet her noble intentions could not transform theft into stewardship or murder into preservation. The Reverend Dr. Phillips conducted a memorial service that drew mourners from across London's cultural circles. Lady Pemberton was remembered not for the manner of her death, but for her generous spirit and commitment to sharing beauty with future generations, a legacy that stood in stark contrast to the possessive passion that had destroyed her. As we walked through snow-covered Mayfair streets, Poirot maintained his characteristic thoughtful silence before offering his final observation. The little grey cells observe how the smallest disarrangements reveal the greatest truths. A smear upon wax, a scratch on a switch, the lonely sweet deliberately positioned. These trifles exposed a psychology that mistook stewardship for sovereignty. When conscience is replaced by personal creed, one begins to tidy away people as one tidies away papers. The Christmas bells began their ancient peal across London's snow-covered rooftops, their clear notes carrying themes of renewal and redemption. Order had been restored, justice served, and truth revealed. The affair at Hollybridge Lane was finally closed, though its lessons about the dangerous intersection of expertise, passion, and moral certainty would linger long after the last echoes of our footsteps faded into the winter night. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, linking his arm in mine as we turned toward home. "The case is finished, and London shall remember only that the Christmas puddings were excellent. It is the proper fate of both tinsel and scandals, to glitter briefly, then be folded away with care." The elegant Georgian townhouse settled into its new geometry of absence and hope, ready to shelter fresh memories unburdened by the shadows of deception and murder. The weeks following Mrs. Blackwood's arrest brought a gradual restoration of order to the lives touched by the tragedy at Hollybridge Lane, though the lessons learned would resonate far beyond the elegant Georgian townhouse where Lady Pemberton had met her untimely end. Poirot, ever meticulous in ensuring proper resolution, maintained correspondence with the principal figures as justice took its measured course through the courts and human hearts began their slow process of healing. The trial of Mrs. Vivian Blackwood became a sensation that captured London's attention far beyond the usual society scandal. Her defense counsel argued eloquently for cultural preservation as a mitigating circumstance, portraying her as a passionate advocate for artistic heritage threatened by modern political correctness. Yet the evidence proved insurmountable. The sophisticated forgery workshop discovered in her Belgravia residence, the systematic fraud spanning decades, and most damning of all, the cold calculation required to murder Lady Pemberton when other methods of persuasion had failed. The authentic Rajah's eye, recovered from its place of honor among Mrs. Blackwood's questionable treasures, underwent extensive authentication by Professor Llewellyn and his Oxford colleagues. Their findings confirmed not only its genuine Muggle craftsmanship, but also the troubling circumstances of its original acquisition during the colonial period. Rather than disappearing into museum storage, the necklace became the centerpiece of a traveling exhibition that toured both Britain and India, sparking exactly the sort of dialogue about cultural heritage and historical responsibility that Mrs. Blackwood had sought to prevent through violence. Miss Sarah Pemberton embraced her inheritance with the same generous spirit that had characterized her aunt. The Hollybridge Lane house remained open to the circle of friends who had known Lady Pemberton at her best, while the Constance Pemberton Memorial Scholarship expanded beyond traditional academic pursuits to fund research into ethical artifact repatriation and international protocols for addressing colonial-era acquisitions. Mrs. Cartwright, elevated from servant to trusted companion, proved invaluable in managing these philanthropic endeavors with her intimate knowledge of London's cultural circles. Timothy Blackwood's transformation proved the most remarkable of all. His position with the Liverpool shipping firm had evolved into genuine expertise in maritime insurance and international trade law. When I encountered him at my club some months later, the dissolute young man of Christmas past had been replaced by someone whose handshake conveyed real strength and whose eyes held focus rather than desperate calculation. He spoke without bitterness of his stepmother's betrayal, though he confessed that the experience had taught him the difference between charm and character. Dr. Ashworth, reinstated at St. Bartholomew's with profuse apologies, carried himself with a humility uncommon to his profession. The experience of being falsely accused had cauterized his vanity about the promised memorial wing, redirecting his energies toward patient care rather than professional aggrandizement. He visited Mrs. Cartwright regularly during her recovery, his gentle ministrations revealing the fundamental decency that had survived his ordeal as an unwitting scapegoat. The cultural implications. The case resonated throughout London's museum and collecting communities, raising uncomfortable questions about the ethics of private acquisition and the complex legacy of imperial cultural appropriation. Mrs. Blackwood's genuine expertise and passionate advocacy had enabled her to rationalize theft and murder as acts of protection, yet her noble intentions could not transform criminal behavior into cultural stewardship. The Reverend Dr. Phillips, in a sermon that was widely circulated, observed that stewardship begins with the humility to admit that beauty does not make its guardian blameless. The legend of the Rajah's eye, he noted, had been wrong in one essential particular. The ruby bore no inherent curse. Rather, people placed their own curses upon it, using it as a mirror for their certainties and justifications. Poirot's final observations. During one of our evening conversations at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot reflected on the psychological complexities that had made the case so challenging. The most dangerous criminals, mon ami, are not those driven by simple greed or passion, but those who convince themselves that their crimes serve higher purposes. Mrs. Blackwood genuinely believed she was protecting irreplaceable treasures from bureaucratic destruction, yet her expertise without wisdom became the instrument of tragedy. He paused to adjust his morning correspondence with characteristic precision, a ritual that never failed to restore his equilibrium after contemplating human moral complexity. Observe how knowledge becomes dangerous when divorced from humility. She possessed profound understanding of Oriental art and sophisticated techniques of preservation, yet she lacked the fundamental wisdom to recognize that beauty cannot be preserved through violence and deception. As spring arrived in Mayfair, bringing renewal to the elegant streets where our Christmas mystery had unfolded, I found myself returning occasionally to Hollybridge Lane. The house had settled into its new identity as a center for cultural philanthropy, its rooms now dedicated to the generous sharing of beauty rather than its jealous possession. The drawing room where Lady Pemberton had died now hosted scholarly discussions about ethical collecting and cultural exchange, a fitting memorial to her generous spirit. The Rajah's eye itself completed its journey home to India with ceremony befitting both its artistic magnificence and the complex history of its acquisition. The repatriation was conducted not in triumph, but in reconciliation, acknowledging both the beauty of the piece and the problematic circumstances of its removal from its cultural context. Lady Pemberton, I believe, would have approved of this resolution, which honored both artistic heritage and historical justice. The final wisdom. The little grey cells observe that true justice extends beyond punishment of the guilty to restoration of proper order, Poirot remarked as we concluded our review of the case. Mrs. Blackwood's elaborate deceptions have been exposed, the stolen treasures returned to their rightful custodians, and the survivors have found ways to honor Lady Pemberton's memory through constructive action rather than bitter recrimination. He rose from his chair with characteristic precision, moving to adjust the window curtains by exactly the margin necessary to admit optimal afternoon light. When we encounter great knowledge divorced from greater wisdom, we must remain vigilant. The affair at Hollybridge Lane teaches us that the most beautiful treasures, human life, trust, the bonds of friendship, cannot be preserved through deception and violence. Beauty is indeed worth protecting, but never at the cost of fundamental decency or human life. As I prepared to leave his immaculate flat, Poirot offered his final observation with the gentle authority that marked all his conclusions. Order, Hastings, is not merely the arrangement of objects, but the alignment of truth with reality. When that alignment is disturbed, chaos inevitably follows, however elegant its presentation. It remains the humble duty of the little grey cells to restore that order, one careful deduction at a time. The Christmas bells of London had long since fallen silent, but their message of renewal and redemption continued to resonate through the lives transformed by our investigation. The affair at Hollybridge Lane was closed, its lessons about expertise, passion, and moral certainty permanently etched in the annals of Hercule Poirot's most psychologically complex cases. Justice had been served, truth revealed, and order restored. The proper conclusion to any mystery worthy of the legendary Belgian detective's methodical attention to the intricate patterns of human nature.